Hello, hello. I'm super late, but that's okay. We're here. And I'm fading that one out because it wouldn't be an Alchemancer stream. Anyway, hello. Hello. Welcome. I have a reason for being late. Right as I was about to get ready to launch stream, I got a message from an artist friend, one of the ones that helped a lot with Alchemancer art, and they surprised me with something. We're gonna switch over real fast. And killed the timer. But give me a second. I gotta show it off because it is so cool. Oh, it's taking up the whole. Hold up. Ugh. Behold. My friend drew this for me. So, for those of you who don't know, Daniel is the character on the left. He is basically my mascot. And he's the one that's in the stream picture. In this one. Same guy. He's a character that I want to use for a Cyberpunk story at some point. And this is further fuel to the fire that I really need to write a Cyberpunk story with him, because, yeah, this, yeah, Naro surprised me with this right before stream. I was just staring at it, almost weeping with joy. It's so, I love Cyberpunk so much. Hold up. And, that's my cat. Naro asked for pictures of Riker, and they put Riker in there, and he's so beautiful. So they're mascots together. He's very precious. Alright, but you guys didn't come here for my characters. Well, you kind of did. You just came here for different characters. Dude, yeah, the koi and the jellyfish are so cool. Alright. So, last time we ripped the Band-Aid. We went into the stadium and all Fanina broke loose. Everybody was shooting at everybody. Naira did rescue her husband, though it was a little dicey there for a minute. Managed to calm him down by giving him a healthy dosage of Tarum and treating some of his wounds. She gave him her bag of crystals, keeping only the gun and her ammo belt, and then her alchemantic suit, but giving him her personal pouch of smaller crystals and things. That way he could treat himself as needed, whether with Prism or with Curum or anything he might need. And sent him off with Detective Melissa to keep him safe. From there, she left because she's got to go hunt down Dravota and ultimately Bradburn. We visited in with Leo and Renetta and all of the people present with Bradburn during his attempt to promote genocide, and they shut it down. He is promoting his own narrative that the maned wolves cannot be trusted and that they're going to become murderous and problematic. He forced the issue by exposing them to his new drug and used them as examples in front of the crowd. And it turned into a gunfight. And Lots of casualties on all sides. Bradburn fled. Leo took off after him. From there, we went over to Naomi, who was up on the roof having a showdown with Tazael. He is currently gassing the stadium. She wants to shut it down. So they fought, and it was epic, but she lost, and he broke her mask, and he ripped her tube so that she couldn't have Prism anymore and took it, and she still fought him anyway, despite him being so much bigger than her. And turns out that her weeks and weeks of practice listening for magic came in clutch, because she was able to sing to the rain and convince it to freeze Tazael in place, lock him down, end the fight, and now she's focused on shutting down his pumps. Only problem, this isn't the only place Tazael is attacking. He went and activated the Central Spire and breached the city's protective dome, meaning that the outside air can now come in, which is bad for people who grew up inside of the city, because their lungs are not going to be used to it. So that'll have consequences at some point. From there, we checked in with Melissa and her escape with Naira's husband, Elaine. And that also turned into a firefight, but they helped each other survive. It was close. And at the end, Tolson and a group of volunteer policemen from District 3 showed up to help out. So now we go over to Rolf. Chapter 59. Short stop. Rolf threw his third electrified punch of the night, dropping another Bradburn goon that had tried to push through to Madame D. From the moment Tazael had asked Rolf to be the door guard for Evo meetings, something had been unlocked inside of him. It was fun to be the guy responsible for keeping the cool people safe and kicking the bad people out. The bigger the bad guy, the better you felt when you threw him out on his sorry rump. But this? Being a bodyguard? Rolf had found his life's calling. What other job lets you deck someone specifically because he gave your friends a funny look? And right now, Madame D was getting a lot of funny looks. Not the, oh wow, that's a famous person, or the, man, they sure dress like my grandma type of looks. More the, I'm gonna ram my stun baton right up her private cabinet type of looks. So, you know, the violent kind. As a group, they'd pushed back out of the conference room and into the main hallways of the stadium, where there'd been a whole lot of bad guys waiting for them. Sort of. They just kind of met up at a corner, and then it had devolved into a frantic melee. Every once in a while, you heard a gun going off, but both sides were so unexpectedly close together, most people jumped straight to batons, knives, or claws. Off to the side, there was a crack of Aurum so powerful everyone in the room flinched or cried out at the noise. Even Rolf instinctively flattened his ears. Over a dozen baddies were sent sailing through the air, like they'd been turned into living kites and swept away in a sudden breeze. Tigra let out a roar of a laugh, lifting his tiger cannon over his head and bellowing, "I love this gun!" Way to be, big guy, Rolf thought with a grin, letting out a bellow of his own as he threw another punch at the nearest baddie. Salzman, Renetta's head security guy in Marston's absence, was barking orders over the fray. "Push them back! Hold the line! Give them Fanina!" and so on. With effort, he pushed his way through the crowd to reach Rolf right as a pair of baton-wielding baddies broke through the line. "Rolf!" 2 seconds, Rolf called out, flaring the electrum in his suit to draw their baton strikes to his plated forearm. Insulated as the suit was, the discharge from their batons didn't affect Rolf in the slightest. Grinning at their surprise and confusion at having their weapon strikes pulled to the side, Rolf readied his own electric discharge, punching one baddie in the nose and haymakering the other across the jaw. "Rolf!" Salzman demanded again. Rolf nearly bounced in place, he was so fired up, but he spared a glance for the man. "Sup? We are not breaking through. We need to fall back to a more defensible position. We have superior firepower, but it means nothing when they have the numbers and proximity to negate that advantage. Parsons' team radioed to say there's another group circling us. We don't want to get surrounded out here. Stick with Minister Dolahan and work your way back the way we came. I'll get word to Master Tigre and the other minister's teams. Rolf's hand came up in a loose salute. Sounds good, boss. He glanced down at Renetta, who stood just a few feet behind him. Ready to move? She nodded, then redirected Rolf's gaze with a frantic gesture. Another baddie got close enough to be a problem, drawing Rolf's attention back towards the enemy. The man brought a stun baton into Rolf's side, wielding the weapon like a bat. As before, the discharge was grounded harmlessly by the suit, but the impact of the blow still hurt. Doing his best to ignore the new bruise, Rolf used his arm to lock up the baddie's arm, then brought him in close before delivering a headbutt. There was no thinking about the move. It happened in a rush of adrenaline and instinct, and Rolf put every ounce of neck strength he had into the hit. Their heads collided with a cracking sound that rivaled a hammer on concrete. Lights washed through Rolf's vision as pain radiated through his whole brain. Fanina. No one had told him that headbutts would hurt. Something that looked so cool shouldn't hurt this bad. Thankfully, the other man was clutching at his head too, so Rolf dropped him a moment later with an electrified uppercut. Gingerly, Rolf pressed his fingers to his forehead, blinking as his vision still swam. Regretting that decision, love? Renetta asked as they started weaving back through the crowd of her own forces. I saw Tigre do it and thought it looked awesome. Turns out, it does not feel awesome. Well, I almost went to the wrong accent there. Well, Tigre has a skull thicker than my hand. I'm not surprised he can get away with that. You, however, my dear, don't have that luxury. So while I admire the willingness to use your head, perhaps it would be in your best interest to stick with the punching and the zapping. Brack, he felt dizzy, and the bright lights weren't really dimming. That was a problem, since the stadium's power had gone out, so, those lights weren't real. I think I might have just given myself a fresh concussion, he admitted. She gave him a smirk, shaking her head in that way mothers do, when they're not really surprised that you did something stupid for the 15th time. All right, love. Let's just walk back this way and find a place to sit down, shall we? Even nodding hurt. Woof. Renetta's troops made way for them, several falling in beside them as they retreated to a nearby conference room. Her people took up defensive positions at the door, now having enough breathing room to rearm with guns. Rolf took an unsteady step, only barely catching himself with a nearby office chair. He intensified his blinking, but that almost made it worse. Glass windows ran the length of the conference room, from floor to ceiling, and Rolf settled against one as he slid to the floor. Renetta gave brief orders to the men guarding the door, then came over to check on him. Rolf pulled out his catalyst and thumbed through his pouch of crystals. With the room being pitch black and his eye full of stars, he grabbed one that looked like it was probably white. Loading his catalyst with it, he put it to his temple and readied to fire. Whoa, whoa, whoa! Renetta nearly tackled him as she pulled the catalyst away from him. Rolf let out something between a sigh and a groan. My head is killing me, Madam D. It's just Curum. Renetta fumbled with the catalyst a bit before finally figuring out how to open the chamber. She retrieved the crystal and squinted at it. Then she held it up to her ear. No, she said after a few moments. This is Aurum. Well, that definitely wouldn't have helped. Oh. Oops. Sorry, Madam D. My eyes aren't working the best right now. Renetta called for a light, and one of her men jogged over with a firearm torch. He held it for her as she dug through Rolf's pouch. Finding a clear crystal, she handed it and the catalyst back to Rolf. He nodded his thanks, regretting it immediately as his head increased its pounding. After taking a moment to load the catalyst, he started treating himself with Curum. Thought you weren't interested in Alchemancer stuff, he said. Renetta huffed, smiling as she pulled out one of the chairs to sit in. She crossed her legs like a fancy person as she turned to face him. I may not always participate, but I do pay attention. As much passion as my daughter has developed for it, I would be bordering on neglectful if I didn't learn at least enough to hold conversations with her about it. The lights in his vision started to fade away, taking some of the headache with them as the Curum took hold. It was a few moments before Rolf knew what he wanted to say. For what it's worth, Madam D, I think you're a pretty cool cat. She snorted, so he hurriedly interjected, I don't mean that in a mean way or anything. It's a compliment. Until 4 weeks ago, I could count on one hand the number of Sneppards I liked. Then I met Moira, and you, and your staff. I even met some cool snops, which is not something I thought existed in Cyphers. It's just nice to know that there's good people on both sides. He felt himself blushing as he added, again, no offense and stuff. Madame D was an emotional rock, the very portrait of how serious politicians were. Her smiles were never broad and carefree in the way Rolf's were. She always held herself back. Rolf had made it a personal goal to find a way to get her to release more of that smile. He'd done it with Moira, so it could probably happen with her mom. He made progress toward that goal as Renetta gave him a slightly wider than usual smile. It wasn't a I'll politely humor you type of smile. It was a you're a precious and adorable child kind of smile. Wasn't exactly what he was going for, as Rolf was, in fact, an adult now, but it was a step in the right direction. I find myself grateful that my daughter has found some good friends. Her smile settled into something more melancholic. There's always been good people on both sides. That's been the basis of my admittedly unpopular business practices. Her gaze drifted away, and she clicked her tongue. I should have done more sooner. Don't be hard on yourself, Madam D. We're all in this fight together now, so what matters is what we do now, you know? Raising an eyebrow, she fixed him with an amused look of challenge only a mother could make. If there's one thing I should hope was unmistakably clear about my character, it's that I have no tolerance for moping or self-pity. So while I may occasionally chide myself, I do so while fully committing to appropriate action. This is not a fight I have any intention of conceding. The stakes are far too large to warrant anything less than my full attention and efforts. At this point, his head was feeling back to normal, so he moved the catalyst down to address the bruises he'd accumulated. Feeling better? Renetta asked. He nodded, and it didn't hurt. That was a relief. Yeah, I think so. She smirked. Then I need you back on your feet, love. The battle's not over yet. But the floor's so comfy. I can reach him just fine from down here. He wasn't serious. He just wanted to widen the cracks. Instead, Madame D's face soured. Did she think he was serious? Adopting a grin he hoped conveyed that he was joking, Rolf pushed himself back onto his feet. It helped, though now she was looking at him like she was dealing with a flatulent child. Flatulent? No, that wasn't the word. Petulant. That was the word. Oof. Maybe he needed to treat his brain a little longer. Something reached his nose as he stood. Something wrong. Tilting his nose into the air, he moved to follow the scent. More of Renetta's guards pushed into the room, prioritizing getting the wounded to safety. This new scent clung to them as they entered, the way smoke naturally sticks to your skin and fur when you spend even a couple minutes beside a fire. Rolf? Renetta asked. What is it? The scent was coming from the hall. It was also coming from inside this room. There was a heaviness to the smell, a density that was slowly dragging it down through the air. Walking over towards a vent near the ceiling, the scent grew stronger. He could feel a faint air current passing through the fur on his face. Even without power, the fans were still going? Rolf? Renetta inquired, standing up and walking towards him. With a start, he realized why it made him think of smoke. It smelled like necrum. Not normal necrum, though. It smelled like... It smelled like the body Naira had brought back. It smelled like those anima spawn of death beneath the prison. Oh, Fanina. She must have read the panic in his eyes, because she addressed him in a very calm voice. Rolf? Rolf gulped. You know the bad necrum that turns people into monsters? I'm pretty sure they're gassing the whole stadium with it. Oh, I went to take a drink of water and almost knocked it over. That would have been bad. Yeah. Chapter 60. Marksman. Gunfire illuminated the back halls as Leo and his team returned fire. They'd cornered Bradburn's retreating forces, but hadn't made headway in punching through. Worse still, Bradburn's men were fearlessly pushing out to meet them. Of these, many were easy to spot in the dark because their eyes were awash with fractal glow. That part didn't make sense to Leo. Bradburn and his forces had deliberately opened fire on people they'd intentionally exposed to fractal. Wasn't Bradburn's whole play to say that fractal was dangerous and needed to be treated with no quarter? So why were his own forces using it? Even more concerning was the effect it seemed to have on them. Leo knew full well how Prism in the system made even the stubbing of a toe into a remarkably unpleasant experience. Yet, these men were charging into a hail of gunfire and barely slowing down. It was like their pain response was just gone. The others had mentioned similar behavior in the monsters they fought below the prism, but these didn't seem like monsters. There was none of the transformative stretching or feral rabidness that Leo would have expected. Instead, it was almost courageous how they charged out into the face of certain death. Unfortunately, it was working. Leo was losing his men far too quickly. These fractal soldiers weren't healing or anything, but they were taking out at least 1 or 2 people before they went down. He had maybe 24 left. If this remained a war of attrition, Leo would lose. They needed to break into the room where the enemy had holed up. Passing orders to continue to watch the exit, Leo signaled for a small group to follow him. About 5 of Renetta's troops fell in behind him as he retreated to circle around the room in question. Coming out behind the room, Leo pressed his ear to the wall. As loud as the gunfire was, a few other sounds made it through to him. Harshly barked orders, a howl of agony. Leo was down to 4 Necrom rounds. He had to hope they would be enough. Stepping back, he fired right at the wall. Through his prism, he envisioned a rough doorway, urging the Necrom forward through plaster and stud and insulation. The first round created a hole roughly 6 feet high by 3 feet across, but stopped short just as the drywall on the other side of the wall appeared. The troops around him had seen him using this weapon for the last 10 minutes to make men's guns disappear. Now that he used it on a wall, they looked at him like he was some sort of superhero worthy of their marvel. If he'd been creating a beautiful door, then maybe that would have been justified. But this was a hole torn with the crudeness of a kid taking a hammer to their bedroom drywall. It was effective, but it wasn't pretty. Spending the second round opened the hole all the way. Renetta's men immediately charged in. Slinging the shotgun behind him, Leo reshouldered a rifle he'd recovered earlier from one of the fallen and followed on their heels. The room in question turned out to be 3 rooms in one. They'd entered at the very back, coming into a room that was minimally guarded. Several cages had been pushed up against the wall, 2 of which were empty, while the third held an emaciated Nulf wearing little more than a loincloth. Trails of blood led from the other cages. Seed Mother. Renetta's people opened fire as they pushed into the adjacent room. Leo spared a pitying look for the Nulf in the cage. "I'll be right back to get you out," he promised. The Nulf regarded him with eyes that held only a faint prismatic glow, but said nothing. One of Renetta's troops stumbled backwards through the door as a bullet took him in the head. Leo swore, scrambling over to check on the man, but he died moments after hitting the floor. The shooting continued, but it wasn't as close as it had been. In fact, as Leo pushed into the next room, Renetta's people had already cleared it of hostiles and were setting up at the final door. This middle room was the most horrific one yet. 2 more Nulfs, a male and a female, sat strapped in chairs, dozens of crimson-stained syringes discarded upon a nearby table. The skin of their inner elbows was bruised, and blood trickled down the skin's natural valleys. One, the male, was clearly dead, while the female had only a faint pulse. Renetta's troops pushed forward as the sounds of gunfire continued to get further away. Leo hurriedly unstrapped the Nulfin woman's arms from the chair, and she stared at his chest with dull eyes. Fanina. He had a few smaller Curum crystals on him, but he barely understood how to use those to treat himself. He had no idea where to start with her. Didn't stop him from trying. Cracking the crystal, he focused on the wounds he could see. As the crystal glowed to life and warmth, the woman blinked slowly, looking up to meet his eyes. With a mangy, almost skeletal hand, she took the crystal from him and clutched it to her bare chest. Like the man in the cage and the man beside her, the only decency she'd been afforded was a tattered loincloth. Her other hand came up to touch Leo's face as she drew in a shuddering breath. Rivotra, she said, her voice trembling as much as her hand. Azafadi. Unkept claws on the ends of her fingers caught on the edge of his mask, pulling with no more strength than a kit tugging on his mother's jewelry. Rivotra? Leo asked. I don't know. My prism? Letting go of the mask, she reached out to touch beside his eye. Her arm dropped as she no longer had the strength to hold it out, but still she held his gaze with dull, pleading eyes. It was all the confirmation he needed. Undoing the straps on his mask, he held it to her mouth. Prismatic glow set in as she took a shuddering breath. Then the Curum crystal in her grasp grew even brighter. Unshouldering his pack, he set the prism tank beside her chair and strapped the mask in place for her. He fished out the remaining Curum he had and gently laid the crystals in her lap. It was a meager offering for one as damaged as she was, but she clearly needed it more than he would. Leaving her there for the moment, he returned to their entry point, where the Nulf in the cage stood waiting. After a quick wave to urge the man away from the door, Leo brought the shotgun up to the lock, using most of his remaining prism and one more Necrom round to dissolve it. The man pushed the door open, stepping from the cage and stretching to his full height. He was lanky and emaciated, but he was still notably taller than the average Cyphus Nulf. Leo wasn't short by any means, but he felt like a teenager again standing beside this man. He didn't reach Tigra levels, but he wasn't far away either. Natives almost were another breed. The Nulf made some kind of gesture that involved folding his hands while leaving the first two fingers extended, and combined it with a partial bow. Leo returned the gesture awkwardly, and the man staggered into the next room. Following behind, Leo watched as the man crouched beside the woman in the chair. Fussing over her with elongated fingers, he touched her like she was made of delicate glass. He helped her crack the remaining Curum crystals. Then he did something concerning. He bit into his own hand. The fleshy part beneath his smallest finger, but still. Leo winced. Having taken many a claw to the hand before, it wasn't something he could imagine willingly inflicting on himself. Blood spilled around the native's teeth as he released his hand. Then he held his hand over her head and squeezed. He rolled his fingers, letting blood fall in controlled spurts that beaded and ran down her forehead. Then he traced down her shoulder and arm, like a chef drizzling a meal. The dark in the room made it easy to spot as the blood began to glow. A few moments later, it absorbed into her skin, leaving only stained fur behind. A hint of color returned to her face. Her condition still looked awful, but her breathing was improving. Lights flooded the room as a small group of Renetta's troops came back inside. Chief, Bradburn punched through! Dross. The lights came up to focus on the pair of Nulfs. The man wheeled against the light, stepping in front of the woman recovering in the chair. He stayed in a low crouch and snarled a warning. Lower your weapons, Leo said, forcing calm into his voice for the native's sake. These people have been through Fanina, and I'm sure they're just as willing to tear any of our heads off if they feel threatened. We need to make it clear we're here to help. The troops obeyed quickly, and the tension in the room eased. The woman who'd brought news of Bradburn's escape nodded over her shoulder. Got something you should see, Chief. Leaving instructions with the other men to stand watch but not look threatening, Leo followed to the last of the rooms. As with the conference rooms, there were a number of bodies here, casualties from both sides. The CO crouched by a body of one of Bradburn's forces and rolled it over. There was a hypodermic needle embedded in his forearm, and the syringe was half filled with blood. There was an almost prismatic sheen to the blood as Leo examined it in their torchlight. They were injecting their men with the natives' blood? Leo's stomach churned. Bradburn's men charging boldly into the line of fire with fractal glow and lack of pain. Natives being subjected to a blood draw. Bradburn's troops giving themselves unsanitary transfusions. It seemed likely that was how the dots connected, but that didn't make it any less horrific. Turning to the CO, he said, "Have your men get the two we rescued to safety. The rest of us will go after Bradburn and..." Gunfire from the hallway cut him off. Had Bradburn circled back? Someone loudly shouted at someone else to stand down. Based on the gunfire that followed, they didn't listen. Leo and the CO were already moving to the doorway when someone else came in. "It's the wounded! They've gone mad! Orders, ma'am?" The CO charged out the door, and Leo was right on her heels. The moment he stepped through, he caught a whiff of something he shouldn't. Something that instinctively drew a hand toward his jacket pocket, even though he didn't actually have a pack on him today. There were 6 anima spawn in the hallway. 4 of them Renetta's men, and 2 of them Bradburn's. They were jumping what portion of Renetta's troops still remained standing, digging in with tooth and claw. And as more people became wounded, they began to exhibit similar changes. Letting out a rather crass string of profanities, the CO unloaded her rifle and swapped for Ame's pacification rounds. She started with the Bradburn troops, firing on them to get a feel for how many rounds it took per person. With each one she hit, the aggression seemed to calm from rabid ferocity to something more like cornered deerhound. It wasn't much of a shift, but it was enough to keep them from continuing to tear into each other. "I'm not going to have enough for everyone," she told Leo grimly while she selected her next target. "They gave you something to help with this, right?" 2 prism grenades hung at his belt, but he wasn't sure those would make a difference against the tainted stuff he could smell in the hall. He still had all his Tarum shells, he was just lacking a concentrated prism source, and he wasn't about to try huffing one of the grenades. Unhooking both of them from his belt, he handed them over to the CO. "Try these. They're non-lethal and might help. If not, I'll be right back," he said, darting back into the room. Her profanities followed hot on his heels, but he didn't have time to explain. The men standing guard jumped as he burst back into Anna. The men standing guard jumped as... 3 in a row, wow. The men standing guard jumped as he burst back into Anima's blood bank. "What's going on?" one of them asked nervously. Again, no time to explain. Leo strode towards the pair of natives. The man was helping the woman to her feet, and he snarled as Leo drew close. "I need my mask back," Leo said, pointing at the woman's face. The man snapped at his finger before again interposing his own body between her and all potential threats. The native held the strap for the prism tank in his hand, keeping it high enough that the short tube didn't tug on the mask the woman still wore. Leo pointed at the tank, racking his brain for the words the woman had first used. "Revotra?" he tried. The man narrowed his eyes at Leo, speaking in full sentences that were lost on Leo. "Revotra," Leo said again, pointing at himself. "I need the Revotra." The man and the woman exchanged a hushed conversation, her words muffled beneath the mask. There was a surprising amount of tongue clicking involved, too. Think, Leo, think. Of course, with all the gunfire and screaming happening right outside, thinking was the easiest thing in the world right now. Who wouldn't be able to focus while bombarded with that much stimulus? The other word popped into his brain, and Leo blurted, "Azafadi?" Both natives turned to regard him. Despite her weary hunch, The pair still towered over him, like parents standing by a preteen. Leo brought his hands together, first two fingers out and touching as he bowed. Ravotra, Azafadi, please? More gunfire rang outside, every shot weighing on Leo's conscience as another potential casualty. The natives shared another look and a brief but agitated conversation as the woman reached up to take off the mask. Oh, thank Seed Mother. She'd understood. The man tried to stop her, but a stern look and verbal rebuke from her made him back down. Then she handed both the mask and the tank back to Leo. Relief coursed through his veins as he took them both and put them back on. The man scowled, but the woman looked at peace. She still looked like she was inches from death's door, but gratitude was something you didn't need language to convey. She gave him the same bow, with a quiet, Misaotra. Leo repeated the word and the gesture, adding in his own, Thank you. Then he sealed the mask and took a breath of prism. The clarity returned, and he welcomed it like a long-lost friend. He could think on prism, without the mental dulling that Necrom always brought. His fingers worked quickly, unloading and stowing the last of his Necrom rounds, and instead loading up 5 Tarum shots. After that, he took one more deep breath and charged out into the hall. It was chaos. The dead far outweighed the living. Of the living, the wounded and monstrous formed the majority. Nearly a half dozen had been dealt with via the pacification rounds and prism bombs, but now a full dozen monsters took their place. This included the CO, who'd been chewed on enough to trigger a change. Now she was chewing back on the one who'd attacked her. A dozen pairs of glowing eyes turned to stare hungrily at Leo as he stepped out full of prism. Despite the laxity of gunfire this evening, an officer is drilled to avoid that luxury. An officer is responsible for knowing exactly where every shot they fire ends up. A detailed report is filed after every case where an officer opens fire. If you can't justify how many rounds you fired, where they ended up, and why you fired them in the first place, then your firearm privileges are revoked until you go through recertification. Leo had spent months on the range, drilling with firearms so that every bullet went exactly where he intended. He'd gotten so much practice as a marksman specifically because he was driven by a single purpose: to avoid unnecessary harm. Count every bullet, make every bullet count. Missing even once could be the difference between saving a life and losing one. Leo had 5 shots and 12 targets, and the most he'd ever roped together in practice was 2. He had more Tarum in his bandolier, but he'd never be able to reload before they reached him. 5 shots, 12 targets. Time to earn his Alchemancer sharpshooter trophy. Firing the shotgun was easier than he'd expected. It didn't eat into his conscience the way his sidearm did. He'd been firing non-lethal rounds at people all day and hadn't batted an eye. If he had to draw the Edwest, could he pull the trigger? Could he take a life to save another? Tarum leapt from the shotgun in a writhing, viney mass. It impacted the 2 closest monsters, clumping them together. During competitions, you had a time limit to take your shots. Sometimes, those time limits were accompanied by the constant tick of a metronome. The closer you got to the end of your time, the faster the tick went. This was intentional. Could the sharpshooter stay cool under mounting pressure? Claws clicked against the floor, providing that accelerating tick as everyone ran at him now. A dozen growls from beneath a dozen pairs of glowing, hungry eyes. They were spreading out, though not because they had the patience for tactics. He'd be dogpiled in the next 5 seconds. 4 shots, 10 targets. Tick, tick, tick. Leo shut out everything but sight and sound and surrendered to practiced instinct. Every sound carried a rhythm that he would bend to his terms. He wasn't a singer, but he had his own song. Deep breath of prism, rack the next Tarum shell, aim, fire. The next closest pair of monsters was swept up in Tarum's embrace, plopping unceremoniously to the ground. Tick, breath, re-rack, fire. Another 2 snapped at each other, Tarum drawing them together just a few feet from Leo. 2 shots, 6 targets. Leo was nothing if not consistent. Unfortunately, they were coming at him in such an uncoordinated rush that he wasn't seeing good openings to get more than 2 at a time. 2 shots. 2 ticks until the timer sounded. 2 seconds until teeth sank into him. Tick, breath, stand, re-rack, step back, aim, fire. They were close enough together now that Leo took a risky shot, aiming for 3 at once. Tarum sought out all 3, vines wrapping around legs and arms and torsos, and binding together like a kit, assuming you could wrap a whole present with just ribbon. It found 2 monsters, but the third managed to slip free. 1 shot, 4 targets, final tick. The momentum of the monster who'd slipped out of the last shot carried him as he stumbled into his fellows. If Leo was to land his miracle shot, it had to happen now. He fired, taking another breath of prism and willing the Tarum to swell and envelop what remained of the pack. It burst from the shotgun like a hungry octopus, casting the hallway in a green glow. Stretching it as wide and thin as he dared, he willed it to constrict. The bundled mass of growing vegetation and flailing anima spawn forced him to take several steps back. He'd finally managed to snare more than 2. He'd done it. His held breath left him like coffee spilled from a knocked-over mug. A clawed hand ripped at the vines as one of the anima spawn tore itself free. Leo focused on the Tarum, willing it to repair and rebuild the restraints. But the anima spawn was faster, and the seeking vines found only empty air. It leapt for him, and his prism gave him the reflexes to strike out with the shotgun, clocking the transformed person across the jaw. As with the soldiers earlier, the body responded to the hit, moving with the momentum, but they showed 0 response to the pain it should have caused. Its weight carried Leo to the floor. The light on his shotgun illuminated a distressingly familiar face. This was the CO for the whole group. Her strength was incredible, and she pinned him to the floor with ease. Had she grown? She'd been smaller than Leo before, but with her snapping teeth inches from his nose, he couldn't tell. Her claws tore into his shirt and vest. Blood gleamed orange on her teeth in the sparse Fyrom light. She snapped at him again and again, trying to find purchase, looking to take in his prism. With considerable effort, he got a hand free and wedged it under her chin, barely keeping those teeth from finding his flesh. The officer in him knew he should be going for his sidearm. He needed to survive this encounter. Bradburn had to face justice. Still, Leo'd never been one for conventional methods. Naira had equipped him with extra options. Lethal force was truly his last resort. He could save this woman. He would save her. His other hand was still pinned, and he rocked his body to try to free it. This earned him a fresh raking with her claws. Fire spread through his torso as the prism flared his pain. Worse, drawing his blood seemed to stir her to greater frenzy, as if she'd caused him to start leaking his prism. Pinned as he was, he couldn't exactly give her his mask, not without being chomped. If he was going to stop her, he needed to get prism in her. Delivering a knee to her gut gave him just enough wiggle room to get his hand underneath himself. She gurgled against his hand, pushing against him so hard she was strangling herself. Spittle flecked onto him with every snap of her jaws, those teeth inching steadily closer as his strength wore down. His pinned hand brushed against his target, his prism line. Working his fingers around it, he tugged and yanked, but the line stayed taut. He couldn't reach the quick release. Improvising, he unsheathed his claws. Then he heard a hiss. With the last of his strength, he pinched her jaw open and shoved the severed end of the prism tube inside. She bit down into the tube, and the glow in her eyes grew stronger. The prism was flowing so unchecked, a good amount of it was blowing back out her nose and into Leo's face. After a few stressful seconds, the definition returned to her eyes, and she let go of the tube. She scrambled backwards in a coughing fit. Leo pinched the tube shut and closed the valve on his tank. He lay there for a few moments, catching his own breath. Without the constant supply of prism, he could smell the outside air now. He felt his internal prism supply rising with every breath, but the accompanying necrom scent told him he was breathing in fractal. Worse, his body reacted to the necrom like he'd just run into a long-lost friend. It stirred up parts of him that he'd rather remain unstirred. His body craved a necral stick, even if his mind wanted nothing to do with the stuff. Examining both ends of the prism tube, it hadn't been a clean cut. Clawwork hardly ever was. Still, if he had to spend the rest of the night walking through a poisoned stadium where the necrom promised him comfort and peace but intended to turn him into a monster, no way he was risking that. He worked quickly, trimming up the ends of the tube and doing his best to shove one end inside the other. It wasn't pretty, and it leaked badly when he tested it. Great. A soft and familiar song drifted through the poisoned air, barely audible over the general grunting, snapping, and snarling of the people currently restrained by Tarim. Leo sat up, looking back and expecting to see Moira. Instead, he saw the native woman. She was leaning in the doorframe, supported by the other native. Her eyes were vibrant with prismatic glow as she sang. It was a tremulous song, one that faltered often as she had to take frequent breaths. Leo's Tarim reactions were still going. They would be for literal minutes. However, at her song, the reactions seemed to pick up speed. The overall green cast to the room increased as the vines swelled, then budded into vibrantly colored flowers. Slowly, the entire hallway calmed, all noises coming to an end except for her song. It was mesmerizing, even with only being able to smell a little of what she was doing with the Tarim. Despite her condition, there was undeniable strength to her voice. Eventually, her song came to its end, and she urged her friend forward with a few quiet words and clicks. Leo continued to fuss with his prism line as he stood to meet them. The native held out her hand expectantly. "Azafadi," she said with a hint of a smile. Whether due to curiosity or an after effect of her song, Leo felt compelled to go along with her. Twisting the line, he brought it to her hands, showing her the damaged portion. She ran a thumb along the place where he'd spliced the line, stopping when she felt the flow of air. Quietly, she started to sing again. Some of the leftover green glow in the air drifted towards her before slipping under her fingers where she gripped the splice in the line. This song was much faster, and she released the line after only a few seconds. As Leo examined it, she'd plugged the gap with Tarim growth, just enough to create a seal without crimping the line. It was incredibly intricate work, something he wasn't sure he could duplicate himself. She seemed pleased with her work, as she had every right to be, and Leo gave her that same alien gesture they used. "Thank you," he said. She returned the gesture, much to her companion's chagrin, before saying a few words in her own language. "I have a friend who would probably love to meet you," Leo said. "She sings at magic, like you do." Of course, the native didn't understand him, but she gave him a pained smile, so at least the friendliness of his sentiment had been conveyed. Leo turned to the last two of Renetta's men. He left the conference room with over 40 people. Now, everyone but these two was either incapacitated or dead. "See to your CO, then get her and the natives outside to fresh air. Try not to breathe too deeply." The two shared a concerned look. One of them spoke up. "Excuse me, sir, but, what in the fanina does that mean?" "If you don't want to end up like your friends, then get to fresh air, and if you can help it, don't get injured." At this point, their CO had recovered her rifle and used the wall to push herself to her feet. She gave him a look of gratitude, followed by concern. "And what are you going to be doing, Chief?" He looked at her, unspeakably relieved that she was mostly back to normal, minus the injuries that had caused her transformation in the first place. "I'm going after Bradburn." "Alone?" she asked. Leo grimaced. "I don't have a choice." After a few moments of thinking it over, she nodded. "Good luck, then." "You too." With a resolved nod of his own, Leo started walking. Death continued to hang in the air, all too happy to let Leo know he was walking to his own grave. Water. I need to switch characters. Chapter 61. Improviser. The echo of gunfire spurred Naira forward. She'd been hot on Dravota's heels for minutes now. From the sound of things, they'd run into Renata's people, giving Naira the time she needed to catch up. Spurts of light flashed through a doorway ahead before the gunfire died entirely. With any luck, Renata's people had won. Naira charged through the door, entering a dark kitchen. Scattered firearm torches lay near the bodies of the fallen. Renata's people had not won this fight. A blur of movement came at her from the side as Naira took the butt of a rifle to her face. Someone else grabbed Naira's rifle, and she fought to keep a hold of it. A hit to the gut released it from her grasp. Fine. They wanted to play rough? Over a dozen pairs of glowing eyes watched from the darkness. Torchlights settled on her as she turned to the closest threat and unleashed a burst of electrum. She turned and hit the next closest with an Aurum punch that sent him staggering against a counter. The other enemies in the room opened fire. Naira flared the electrum in her suit, activating the plating and using it to redirect the incoming bullets in any direction but her own. Grunts of pain and cries of surprise sounded as Dravota's men were subjected to the ricochet. They stopped shooting almost immediately. "Get her," a familiar voice called in the ensuing quiet. Dravota was in the room. With all the lights resetting her ability to see in the dark, she couldn't tell which one he was, but he was in here, and she had no intention of letting him leave. Someone rushed into her periphery. Flaring her electrum, Naira aimed at a nearby pan. The electromagnet sucked it to her palm. Catching the handle, she whipped it to the side, electrifying the pan as she swung. It smashed into her attacker's face, sending him sprawling to the ground. Someone ran at her from behind, and she swung in that direction, catching this one under the jaw before knocking him back with an Aurum burst from her free hand. Only a few firearm torches remained focused on her before the room came to life with a half-dozen sparking electrum batons. She barely caught the glint of a few knives, too. Those would be the biggest threat, since they'd be hard to see with this terrible lighting. 4 people rushed her at the same time. With a pulse of Aurum, Naira threw herself out of the way, landing on top of the nearest counter. Pots and pans clattered to the ground as her momentum carried her through them in an awkward roll. 2 more people were on her almost immediately. She caught the first baton swing with the magnets in her forearm before separating it from its owner with an Aurum punch. The other one caught her suit, which grounded his baton harmlessly. The blow still hurt, and was too close for comfort. A little to the side, and she'd have taken the discharge through her body. Spinning, she released the baton she'd confiscated from her magnets, then drove it point first into her attacker's face. He'd barely hit the ground when another 3 men were already on her. They fell on her with a series of blows she barely deflected with the aid of her suit. It helped that she could throw off their momentum with well-timed pushes or pulls from her magnets. In fact, she threw one so off balance that he nearly hit his ally. This bought her time to drop one with an electrum burst. She heard a familiar crack and spun. The guard who'd stolen her rifle when she came in the room had just fired it at her. There was Aurum in there, and the guard clearly had some amount of prism in his system. If he knew what he was doing with her catalyst, she was in trouble. He frowned. He'd been expecting it to fire a bullet. Naira used her own Aurum supply to roll herself over a nearby counter, covering her ears a split second before the Aurum from her rifle released. The air in the kitchen exploded with a loud pop, and any cooking utensils or cookware that had been on the counters was scattered in all directions like a cutlery grenade. Even ducked in the relative safety behind the counter, Naira felt her loose fur ruffle as the powerful burst of wind magic filled the room. People cried out as they were flung into walls or counters. With an Aurum burst of that strength and a room full of hostile sneppards, everyone's ears had to be ringing. Hers were to a small extent, and she'd had the foresight to protect them. Methodically, Naira used the scattered torches and groans to move from target to target, zapping each soldier she found in turn. With a pulse of her electromagnets, she scooped up a firearm torch and checked each person as she dropped them. Sneppered. 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 Where was Dravota? A burst of flame assaulted her from her right. Dropping the torch, Naira activated her Aurum, using a burst of wind to scatter the flame and throw her to the side. It wasn't quite fast enough to keep her from being singed, and she could tell her neck had been burned. Kurum would fix it later. Another gout of flame rushed towards her, and she met it head-on with Aurum. At least, until her battery drained. Dross. In the dim, scattered light in the room, Naira caught the glint as Dravota raised a handgun at her. She activated her suit as he opened fire. She caught each bullet in turn, intending to fire them right back at him. Eventually, the gun clicked as he ran out of ammo. It was her turn. Unfortunately, her Electrum ran out at the same time. Great. The bullets dropped harmlessly to the floor as the electromagnets powered down. Naira reached up to disengage her dead batteries, but Dravota was on her immediately, and he brought a knife. The first swing scraped off her forearm plating as she narrowly redirected it away from her face. The second swipe was down at her stomach, and her dodge backwards backed her against a counter. Her hands searched behind her for anything she could use to fight back, but everything had already been knocked onto the floor. Fine. His next swipe caught her in the abdomen. It was superficial, but it still hurt. She hated knives. Naira delivered a kick to Dravota's legs, buying her time to dive to the floor. She gripped the first thing her fingers brushed, scrambling back to her feet and settling into a defensive posture with a spatula. He stepped forward with another swing of his blade. Naira stepped into his swing, battering his soft, fleshy arm with her own armored one. Then she lit into his face with the spatula, slapping him again and again as she aimed for his eyes. Turning the spatula, she swung it like a knife and chopped against his throat. The spatula snapped, so she stabbed it at his shoulder. It didn't punch through his skin, but it definitely seemed to hurt. He threw her off of him, using the knife to keep her at arm's length. It took all her focus and a precise series of kicks and jabs to keep that knife from catching her body. Their fight took them around the perimeter of the kitchen as Dravota relentlessly pushed the attack. They'd done a full circle when Naira stepped on something that rolled out from under her. With no Aurum to catch herself, she fell flat on her back. Dravota glared down at her with prismatic eyes, yet he wore no mask. They'd been fighting for over a minute. How did he still have Prism in his system? As winded as she was, surely he should have run out by now. Giving her no further time to wonder, Dravota planted a kick in her side. Naira took the blow, which shoved her against a counter. He came in for a second kick, and she caught it, grunting at the blow, but trapping his leg. She delivered a punch to his knee. From the corner of her eye, she caught a glimpse of what she'd tripped over. It was a rolling pin. Snagging it, she brought it up, catching Dravota's arm and preventing a knife strike that had been headed straight for her throat. From there, she swung at anything she could reach. His leg, his arm, his side, delivering blow after blow with the heavy dough flattener. A blow to the wrist made him drop the knife, and Dravota stumbled backward. He leaned into a counter as Naira got back to her feet. His hand went into his coat pocket and came back out with a deep violet crystal. It was the same shade as the one Bradburn had used to change Paddock. He brought it up and slammed it against the countertop with a loud crack. Not giving him a chance to hit it again, Naira brought the rolling pin down on his wrist, putting everything she had into the blow. The crack this time wasn't the crystal. In fact, he released the crystal, crying out in pain as he nursed a newly limp wrist. She turned to him, holding the rolling pin at her side like a displeased mother as she spat out, "Why, Dravota? Why on Fanitum are you working with the man who wants us all dead?" Dravota sucked air in through his teeth, his eyes still awash with prism. It took him a few attempts to find words around the pain of his broken wrist. "Bradburn represents progress. Necessary evolution for a city grown stagnant. His progress is going to get your family killed. This drew a snarl from the man. Leave them out of this. My work keeps them safe. Safe like Elaine? He's alive, isn't he? Thanks to us, we've returned him better than we found him. Naira felt a pit forming in her stomach. You're mad. You and Bradburn are creating monsters. No, Dravota said with a pain-ridden sneer. We're creating natives. Naira blinked. That had been the language Paddock had used. He'd said, I don't want to go native. At the time, she'd written it off as distasteful slang. Now, she realized he'd been serious. Naira shook her head. You and I both know that's not how it works. You have to be born into it. Grow up outside the bulb. Raised on Phantom's air. You can't force the change on adults. It doesn't work. The body has to grow used to it, gradually, or you get sick. We found a shortcut. A way to level the playing field. Naira glanced back at the discarded purple crystal. It was just a shade too dark to be pure necrom. A crack lined the surface of it, but it hadn't been enough to start the reaction. Why? Bradburn doesn't want to get caught flat-footed. When the natives attack the bulb, we'll be ready. Do you hear yourself, Dravota? That's Bradburn talking, not you. The natives are nomads. They survive off the land. They're not some big militaristic threat. Fanina, we both came out of that culture. How can you possibly believe a lie like that? I've seen what they can do, he said, voice low as he cradled his hand to his chest. They're frighteningly strong, even with just a little prism in their own blood. You and I may think we're Alchemancers, but we're like unchained children by comparison to the natives. We're kids play fighting with sticks, while the adults are practicing with real swords. If they decide to come after the bulb, we're screwed. It'll be a worse massacre than anything Bradburn might do. You've swallowed his lies, Dravota. He snorted. I don't think so. I've got to do everything I can to provide a future for my family. Then help me take him down. He shook his head. They're playing for the wrong side, Salatra. Bradburn's going to win. It's as simple as that. She didn't notice his hand drifting to his side until it came back with a red crystal. She shook her head. Dravota, we were friends once. Don't do this. I don't have a choice, he said, and cracked the crystal. Naira flung the rolling pin at him, hitting him straight in the muzzle. The fire in his hand sprang to life, shooting off at an angle and missing her entirely. Dravota collapsed to the ground, hard. She watched him as the room returned to a state of low lighting. How had her world been turned so upside down that even her old friends wanted the world to burn? Turning her back, she went and collected the purple crystal he'd left on the counter. A gunshot split the silence. 3 more followed on its heels. Naira's eyes went wide, and she sucked in fresh prism, looking for where the bullets had hit her. Only, they hadn't. She was fine. Spinning on her heels, she found Dravota inches away from her, knife clutched in his good hand, blood pouring from several fresh holes in his chest. He looked down at them, then staggered backwards. The knife slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor as Dravota collapsed for good. He'd made his choice. Naira searched for the shooter and found him, one of Renetta's forces lying on the ground. Scooping up a Fyram light, Naira hurried over to find a man who'd pulled himself into a seated position against one of the kitchen walls. His name tag read, Bryce. He gave her a pained smile, his gun resting in his lap. We have to stop meeting like this, Alchemancer. Agreed. He glanced past her. Sorry. Sounded like you knew him. But I saw him go for the knife and your back was turned, so it was either him or you, and I... He trailed off. After a moment, Naira shook her head. Don't be sorry. You did the right thing, and you saved my life. I'm alive thanks to you. How about you? Bryce groaned. I took a pretty nasty hit to the head almost the moment I came in here. We literally bumped into these guys, and it turned into a frenzy. My head's still pounding and my leg hurts, though I'm pretty sure I just messed it up when I fell. There was growing prism behind his eyes, too. On a hunch, Naira pulled down her mask. She could immediately smell the necrum, along with that strange odor she'd caught on Paddock. It was in the very air of the room. Testing the purple crystal she'd taken, it smelled quite similar, though she was careful not to breathe too deeply. Instinct brought her hand to her hip, intending to get Curum to treat the boy. Only as her hand passed through empty air did she remember she'd given her alchemy bag to Elaine. "Can you walk?" she asked. Bryce grimaced. "Everything feels a little fuzzy, but yeah, probably." "Good. Check to see if anyone else survived. Then try to regroup with the rest of Reneth's people. Tell anyone you find that the Alchemancer said to get outside and get to fresh air. They're poisoning the stadium, and it's no longer safe inside. While you do that, I'm going to track down Bradburn and end this." That brought the boy's expression into panic. Despite the width of his eyes and his heightened breathing, he nodded resolutely. "I'll get it done. Good luck, Alchemancer." She patted him on the shoulder. "Good luck to you, Bryce." Then she donned her mask and stood up. A quick search of the kitchen turned up the heirloom rifle. The stock was ruined, and the barrel had been warped by the undirected Aurum explosion. Great. If she survived this, Ame was going to kill her. Leaving the rifle behind, she stepped out of the room. She'd barely left the kitchen when Moira's voice boomed through the vents as loudly as if they'd been speakers. "Tigra, if you can hear me, I need Aurum on the roof, and I need it now. I found the source of the gas, but I need help stopping it." Good girl. Smiling in relief, Naira took off in a run. Oh, give me a sec. I have to get something for this. Because I actually have pictures now for this. If I go to the right folder. Art. Let's see how this one looks. Oh, super big. Just the biggest, most bigliest picture. Oh, no. Did I script? Okay. We're good. We're good. Let's do that. And then we'll do a little bit of this action. A little bit of this action. A little bit of that. Holy, nah, I think I gotta have that. There we go. I need to show our hands, though. Yeah, there we go. All right. Move this down so that it's with the other. There we go. Aha! Okay. Guess whose turn it is? Spoilers. I love this chapter. Chapter 62. Ice Queen. "We should have gone with her," Marston said for the 10th time in 5 minutes. "So you could keep her company while she waits for Tigra in arguably the safest place in the stadium right now?" Naomi asked. This drew a frown from Marston, and he shot her a withering glare. Too bad for him. Naomi was too cold to melt. "My duty is to the family," he insisted. "Time to try a different approach, then." Your duty is also to your men and to these people. You saved this concert, dude. He rolled his eyes at the word dude. It wasn't her fault that he was incapable of lightening up. No sooner had Moira disappeared into the vents than a whole bunch of Bradburn mooks had shown up to the concert. They'd attempted to start arresting the crowd based on the fractal filling the room. Marston had intervened immediately, and his men had neutralized the Bradburn squad without a single gunshot. Admittedly, there was enough of a melee that the band had stopped playing for a few minutes. When the dust settled, Naomi had gone up and encouraged them to continue, to calm the rising panic of the crowd. Thankfully, they'd listened, though there was only so much they could do without power. Overall, though, it was an absolute win, and still Marston wasn't happy because he couldn't get over his fixation on the Dolahans. So now, Naomi and Sergei walked with Marston and a small squad of his men. Their search for roof access resumed. Finally, Marston muttered as they found the stairs. No sooner had the three of them entered the stairwell than the shooting began in the hallway they just left. Hostiles! Someone on Marston's crew shouted. Marston swore, his eyes bulging and his whiskers twitching like he'd just eaten something sour. With a look like that, Naomi was surprised he hadn't punched the wall. With an exasperated sigh that morphed into a snarl, Marston waved them on. Go make sure Miss Moira is taken care of. I'll catch up. Voicing his frustration through an impressively crude string of profanities, Marston disappeared through the door and joined his men. Sergei and Naomi made it to the first landing before Sergei paused. Turning back, the beefy butler bit his lip. I can't shake the feeling he's going to need help. Naomi sighed. She'd been thinking the exact same thing. Decision made, she pointed up the stairs. Go find Moira. I'll keep Marston safe. Smirking, Sergei said, Don't let him hear you say that. I think it'd be funny. All that tension bottled up in him might finally explode. The man does need a vacation, or something. Sergei trailed off, glancing up as the gunfire below them continued. Yeah, Naomi muttered, then jerked her head upwards, motioning up the stairs. Get going. They exchanged nods, then Sergei went up, while Naomi headed back down. Activating both Aquam batteries in her suit, she took a deep breath of prism and pushed her way through the door. The darkness of the hallway was thick, cut only by the slicing motion of firearm torches and muzzle flashes of the numerous guns firing on both sides. One of the torches from the other end of the hall swung her way, illuminating her where she stood by the door. Instinctively, Naomi activated her Aquam, building a layer of ice that extended from the door to shield her right as someone shot at her. Bullets ricocheted off the ice, and she ducked, but the ice held. Keeping the reaction going, Naomi continued to spread the wall, giving herself cover as she moved forward in a low crouch. Several of Marston's people watched her with surprise as she joined them, but gave her respectful nods. There were close to a half-dozen friendlies who'd been shot in those opening moments, and still lay out in the open hallway. Several were wounded and groaning. With both sides currently firing on each other, these had been forgotten. Okay, that was something Naomi could help with. Employing the same tactic she'd used to reach cover, Naomi built herself a wall of ice that extended from the point of safety out to the first body. She gripped his vest and gave a grunt of exertion as she started dragging him backwards. With meathead friends like Rolf and Tazael, Naomi kept herself in shape to maintain a competitive edge. Even so, dragging a full adult kitted out in tactical gear like a soldier was still hard work. Thankfully, several other friendlies saw what she was doing and rushed over to help her. They did this for each wounded person in turn, with Naomi providing mobile cover so they could be dragged to safety. Then she built additional cover for those who were still firing, leaving the hallway with so much scattered ice it looked like snow season. She turned her attention to the wounded then, breaking out Curum and working with the team's own field medic. No sooner had she begun a treatment than a hand clamped on her shoulder and a voice hissed in her ear. What the fanine are you doing back here, Kit? I told you to get to the roof. She glanced over her shoulder to find Marston hovering in her personal space and looking characteristically grumpy. Sergei's on it. I figured you could use some support. Extra guns, maybe? Someone from the front line cried out as a bullet took them in the shoulder and dropped them to the ground. Marston growled and swore again. I wish you'd listened, girl. But since you're here, can you give us better cover? She nodded. Show me where you want it. From that point on, she left the treatment of the wounded to others, focusing solely on using her aquam to make cover for those who needed it. Making ice in those quantities drained her batteries fast, and after a few minutes of continual use, she had to swap them both out. Eventually, she'd plastered the walls and floor with about as much ice as was reasonably useful. The people on their side were starting to run low on ammo, a major problem considering the fact that the other side was still shooting. They dropped some of the enemy, but not enough to end the fight. Naomi crouched among Renetta's people, who all expressed their gratitude as she patched up holes and breaks in the ice. Marston came over and gripped her arm. Get back to safety. You have done your part. Returning Mr. Grumpy Pants' frown was rather easy. I'm here so I can help. Having a kid on the front lines isn't going to help, because it's going to distract the rest of us. Seed Mother, how many times do I have to say it? I'm an adult, Marston. I'm not in the mood to argue this, he shouted over another volley of gunfire. I thought arguing was the only mood you had, Naomi yelled back. You can't shoot a gun, so you can't deal with our enemies. If you're going to insist on staying up here with us, then either play defense or get off the field. They glared at each other for several long seconds before Marston rolled her eyes. Whoops. They glared at each other for several long seconds before Marston rolled her eyes. They glared at each other for several long seconds before Marston rolled his eyes and let out an exasperated sound as he started shooting over the wall of ice once more. Naomi could shoot a gun. It wasn't like the concept was difficult. But with the large rifles they were using, she was pretty sure the recoil would make her aim pretty useless. Play defense or get off the field. An idea struck her, an option he'd left out. A way to stay on the field while playing offense. Activating her aqua in a brief burst, she formed a ball of ice in her gloved hand. With her prism, she was able to mold it into a sphere about the size of... With her prism, she was able to mold it into a sphere about the size of an orange, but far denser. Yet it wasn't the size that dictated when she stopped. It was the weight. When she reached a weight that was comfortable, she gave the ball of ice a quick toss into the air. Yeah, that would do nicely. Crouch running behind cover, Naomi went to a spot that wasn't currently drawing any fire. Peeking over the wall, she looked for a target. A number of Bradburn's people had moved up, looking to press their numbers advantage. Someone peeked around a pillar, aiming at someone else down the line. That would work. Excuse me while I indulge in one more, because again, I have it, and I might as well use it. Oh, it's so big. Oh, that's not the right button. That's the right button. Haha. Haha. Yeah. Let's go, kid. Naomi got to her feet, wound up, and threw a fastball. It drilled the guard in the head, dropping him to the ground. The ball of ice bounced off his head, uncracked, as it disappeared into the darkness. Naomi grinned, feeling rather pleased with herself, and formed another ball of ice. She rolled her arm a few times while she looked for another target. She found it in the form of a man peeking over a couch they'd moved out for cover. Her next pitch took him in the eye, and he dropped out of view. If you wanted to strike out a team of boys, you needed two things from your pitches: speed and precision. Unpredictability was a nice third, but even that still boiled down to precision. Naomi wasn't known for letting batters score runs. The third target was one moving from cover to cover. Her pitch caught him in the temple and sent him sprawling to the floor. When some baddies finally noticed her, she ducked behind the ice and moved to a new position to continue her pitching. Much to her satisfaction, and ultimately relief, her efforts seemed to turn the tide. Her cover had reduced their own losses, and out of over a dozen throws, she only missed 2. Even those had still hit their target, just as glancing blows. Eventually, the skirmish was over. Marston's men spread out to check on their own and secure any remaining Bradburn guards. Marston still looked annoyed with her, but he gave her a curt nod, so that was at least progress. Stretching her arms, Naomi winced. It would have been nice to have a chance to warm up first. Checking her equipment, all that effort had used up a fair bit of her stores. Both her batteries and her prism tank had dropped below half. At least this fight was over. "Stand down!" someone barked. Naomi and Marston both looked up. At the end of the hall, the half-dozen or so of Marston's men, still in fighting condition, were confronting a group of 4 unarmed sneppards in Bradburn attire. "I said, stand down! Hands on your heads, knees on the ground, now!" The 4 looked at each other, exchanged grins, then lunged. Marston's men opened fire right away, but it didn't seem to matter. These 4 took lots of bullets, but it hardly even slowed them as they tore into Marston's men with their claws. The more they fought, the more damage their bodies took, the more their eyes came alight with prismatic glow. That wasn't too shocking. As much fractal as there was in the air, Marston and his men had fractal glow too. Thankfully, she could smell that it was a clean batch. The necrom content was so low, it might as well have been prism. What was shocking was that the glow intensified with every bullet these people took. Worse, their bodies started to change, their features stretching, their fangs and claws elongating. Bradburn had turned some of his own soldiers into monsters. Brack, this was bad. "Wall off the wounded!" Marston barked. Naomi blinked, her brain starting to kick in again. As instructed, she took the next few seconds to build a wall of ice to seal off the branch in the hall that led to their wounded troops. The last of Marston's active men fell as one of the monsters tore out his throat. Discarded firearm torches cast the monster's shadows on the walls, catching the blood dripping from their fangs in magnified form. 4 anima spawn. It had taken 6 people to stop 4 of these things last time. Now there was only Marston and Naomi. 1 gunman and 1 Alchemancer. Brack. They were in so much trouble. Beside her, Marston swapped magazines, and Naomi caught the refracted glint of crystal-tipped bullets. All 4 monsters broke into a sprint, arms not quite long enough for comfortable quadrupedal quadrupedal. That's going to be fun. All 4 monsters broke into a sprint, arms not quite long enough for comfortable quadrupedal movement. Yet. Naomi sucked in more prism as Marston opened fire. Credit where credit was due, the man was actually a really good shot. Unfortunately, just like the monsters they fought below the prison, these were made of sturdy stuff, and his shots did little to slow them down. Crouching, Naomi planted her hands on the floor and tapped into her aquam. A sheet of ice spread out before them, like she dumped out dozens of buckets of water at once. As dark as the hallway was, the ice held a visibly soft blue glow where the reaction spread. As fast as they were running, the anima spawn all went through various stages of losing their footing. One slipped and landed flat on their back. Naomi directed more aquam their way, coating them over with a layer of ice like she just tucked them into bed. The momentum of the next one in line was carrying them straight for Naomi. Naomi built a banked curve of ice in front of her that angled the monster away from her and Marston, redirecting it until it slammed into a pillar. Shots from Marston dropped the next one, impacts from the bullets snapping its mostly sneppard-shaped head backwards as it crashed onto its back. The last one got enough footing to leap for Marston, and they both crashed to the ground. Marston's claws were out immediately, and the creature responded in kind. Before Naomi could move to help, the one that had kissed the pillar recovered enough to leap for her. Its jaws opened wider than a sneppard should, so she filled it full of aquam, freezing its mouth open. Didn't stop the thing from colliding with her and shoving her back, but the anima spawn hadn't expected to lose the ability to use its teeth or develop such a top-heavy head. It unveiled oversized claws, drawing blood from Naomi's arms. Letting out a curse, she forced aquam into the special air pockets of her suits extending steel claws of her own. I can do it too, Brecker, she snarled, before embedding the thumb-sized knuckle spikes into the soft spot where jaw met neck. It gagged, its mouth still frozen open as its blood ran down Naomi's forearm. Crunching into the monster's foot with her cleats, Naomi leaned in, delivering punch after punch to the thing's guts. Something jumped her from behind, and teeth sank into her shoulder. The loss of Prism started right away as another anima spawn attempted to drain her. She gripped her attacker by the hair, digging into the roots by its ears and pulling its head into her view. Activating more Aquam, she formed a spike of ice in her palm and drove it straight into the creature's eye. She kept adding Aquam to the reaction, causing the spike to swell and prickle with dozens of smaller expanding spikes until the monster released her shoulder. It stumbled backwards, clutching at its eye, so Naomi delivered a kick to its chest, driving her cleats in until they found bone. By this point, the first one to attack her had started to heal, though it seemed incapable of dealing with the ice stopping up its mouth. That was unexpected. The monsters beneath the prison had somehow countered their alchemancy. Naomi explicitly remembered driving a spike of ice through a monster's jaw, only to have the ice melt away into water. For whatever reason, this one wasn't doing that. Not that Naomi was about to suggest it. It lashed out in a series of claw strikes that drew more blood from Naomi. She blocked the bulk of the blows, keeping them from finding anything vital. But Seed Mother, those claws were painfully filleting her arms. Tapping into her Aquam, she released a frigid blast in her attacker's face before stepping into a series of punches that ended with her driving her knuckle spikes into the thing's chin. There was enough force behind the blow to knock the monster flat on its back. Beside it, the one that had taken an ice spike to the eye seemed to stop caring about it. Blood was no longer pouring out around the spike, having frozen over and adding a layer of purple-tinted crimson to Naomi's ice. Naomi had never killed someone before. Adrenaline and instinct were driving her blows. She knew this was a fight for survival, her or the monsters. Some of these hits should have killed a normal person. The fact that they were still standing just made things worse. She didn't want to kill anyone, but neither was she ready to die. If it had to be them or her, then she'd give them Fanina. The one she'd frozen to the floor earlier wrenched an arm free, then a leg. Brack! She couldn't get even one of these things to stay down? Gunshots sounded nearby as Marston lit into the creature, pinning him to the floor. Seizing the opportunity, Naomi abandoned the two she'd been fighting. She ran straight for Marston. With a sweep of her hand, a spike of ice as thick as her leg erupted from the ground, punching through this monster's throat. Hopping to stop her momentum, she drove her cleat into its skull, knocking it off of Marston entirely. Marston was a mess. Blood poured from gashes in his legs, his torso, and most concerningly of all, his throat. He was alive, but losing blood fast. Naomi glanced at her prism gauge. Her tank was getting dangerously low. The anima spawn on the floor broke free from the rest of the ice, growling as it got back to its feet. That was bad enough. Then it spoke. "Enough messing around," it said, in a voice that sounded too thick to carry through the air. "Kill them already. We've got a concert to attend." All four creatures were still up. The three that Marston and Naomi had been working on looked almost as bad as Marston did, but it didn't show in their posture. They looked as ready to fight as if they just rolled out of bed. Their healing seemed to be slowing, so that was one silver lining. At least a few of their wounds continued to bleed that too-deep crimson. They rushed straight for her. Ducking into a crouch, Naomi tapped into both batteries, encasing her and Marston in a solid dome of ice. Something collided with the outside of the dome, causing a resounding crack. Naomi put everything she had into reinforcing the barrier until both batteries were depleted. The ice around them gave a soft glow as the reaction wound down, casting both of them in a shade close to moonlight. Naomi shivered. She liked working with Aquam, but even she had to admit that it was freezing inside this little dome. Loading a Curum crystal into her catalyst, Naomi set to stopping the bleeding from Marston's throat. The crystal cracked, and she bit into her tube for more prism. None came. Dross. Ignoring the gauge, she reached back and tested the valve. It was full open. She bit down again, hoping to squeeze even just a little more out, and nothing. Brack, she swore. My prism's out. Marston gulped, blood spilling from him like water from a sponge. Naomi's fingers clenched into fists. There had to be something she could still do. Anything. Hand clamped to his throat, Marston choked on his own blood as he tried to say something in reply. With great effort, he rolled over, tapping something on his hip with his free hand. His blood-slicked fingers slipped off a spray can-looking device tucked into his belt. He still had a prism grenade. Not even bothering to pull it out of his belt, Naomi yanked the canister's pin. The next second stretched excruciatingly before a loud hiss reached her ears, and the wonderful scent of crisp rain with a hint of damp soil filled their tiny dome. Taking a deep breath, Naomi felt her senses return to life as she latched onto what remained of the Curum reaction. She sent every bit of it right for his throat. Thankfully, these high-grade crystals were faster and stronger than normal, and the bleeding stopped within seconds. She didn't want to think about how close he'd been to death. With his neck healed, she turned her attention to his torso. Slowly removing his hand, Marston prodded at his throat, then let out a sigh of relief. Thanks, Kit. Naomi sighed. Just saved your life, and you still won't use my name? There was a long silence, split only by the crack of the next Curum crystal. The Curum brought much-needed warmth to their tiny space as she worked. Finally, Marston replied, Sorry, Nairobi. She stared at him, dumbfounded. Not because the word sorry had left Marston's mouth, but because she'd never heard anyone butcher her name so badly. Do you not even know my name? He raised an eyebrow, meeting her gaze. Is that not your name? Allowing herself a good snort, she shook her head. It's Naomi. Oh, he said, laying back and staring up at the thick layer of ice hanging just a few feet overhead. I was close. That drew a laugh from Naomi as she finished with his torso. Maybe if you were trying to say my name around a mouthful of canina. I could go for some canina and honey right about now. She gave him a scrupulous look as she started applying Curum to his legs. You know about canina? Yeah, it's that tasty flatbread stuff. You know it's a Nulfin specialty, right? Marston sat up to look at her. You're kidding. Something dark collided with the outside of the dome. Something else followed suit a moment later. The dome held up against both, though a layer of frost sprinkled down on both survivors like snow. Conversation paused as Marston and Naomi looked anxiously at the only thing standing between them and being torn to shreds by monsters. I always got mine from the store, Marston continued quietly. It was something my mother introduced me to, and she always knew exactly which aisle they hid the fresh batches in. Letting the thought linger for only a second, Naomi asked, Since it's going to take a minute to patch us both up, want to talk about why you hate Nulfs? Marston snorted. I don't hate Nulfs. Naomi fixed him with a look. She wasn't buying any of his dross. He shrugged. I'll admit, there's not many I like, but that doesn't mean I hate them. And you think that's sufficient reason not to bother to learn my name? He let out a long-suffering sigh, like she was a toddler pestering him with inane questions. Look, I said I'm sorry. I'll remember your name as Naomi next time. Finishing with his legs, Naomi set to addressing the wounds on her own arms. Do I scare you? She asked. No. It's okay to admit that you're intimidated by women that are taller than you. I'm not intimidated by... Then you should be able to use my name and speak to me like I'm a normal person. A couple moments passed in silence before he let out a laugh of disbelief. We're both seconds from death, and you're hung up on semantics. They're not semantics. It's a matter of respect. Stop being dramatic. I'm sure you're still hurting, but I kept you from dying. Bad news was, after healing her arms, she'd be out of Curum. No more second chances after this. But Mr. Pessimism didn't need to know that. Marston grew very quiet, no doubt annoyed with her. She half expected him to tell her to drop the dome so he wouldn't be trapped with her any longer. Instead, he muttered a quiet but firm, "Thank you." "Thank you," she prompted. "Thank you, Naomi." "You're quite welcome, Marston." He laughed again, the "I still can't believe you're lecturing me on this when we're both about to die" kind of laugh. But it wasn't derisive this time. She even joined him with a laugh of her own. Scraping sounded through the dome. Dark shadows surrounded it as the anima spawn tried digging their way inside. Naomi flinched despite herself. Marston gave her a look, and she snapped, "What? Those things are incredibly unpleasant." He smirked. "Nothing to be ashamed of. I'm scared too." Finished attending to her arms, Naomi swapped for her last pair of Aquam batteries. She held them up. "Once I use these, I'm out of ice." He sighed, picking up his gun and doing an ammo check. "Yeah, I'm running low myself." "Bottom of the ninth. No better time to go out swinging." He glanced at her again, surprise in his voice. "You like baseball?" It took every ounce of restraint left in her body not to smack him in the shoulder. Ultimately, the only reason she didn't was because she didn't have the energy to spare. "You've actually managed to avoid learning anything about me, haven't you?" Marston sighed. "It's not personal, I promise. There's just history." "And your drossy history should affect my life or our relationship. Why, exactly?" He snorted. "Fair point. If we survive this, I'll be better." "When we survive this," Naomi said, with a forced emphasis she didn't truly feel. Yeah. When?" Gesturing at the dome, he asked, "So, how are we getting out of here?" Naomi locked the final Aquam battery in place. "When you're ready, I'll show you. Are you ready, or do you want a few more minutes to pout?" Despite the grim resignation in his eyes, Marston's smirk widened all the way to the back of his jaw. "Nah, think I hit my quota for the day." His grip tightened on his gun. "As ready as I'm gonna be." She shrugged. "All right." Activating her Aquam, she pushed. Inside the dome, she couldn't see the spikes she was forming as she turned their dome into a porcupine. She expanded it outward, lifting the dome off the ground with a new foundation of ice. She left a gap, enough for her and Marston to leave their protection behind. Stepping through, they wheeled, Marston scanning the hallway with his torchlight. Marston scanning the hall with his torchlight. Two of the anima spawn hung from the outside of the dome, impaled on the fresh spikes of ice and flailing as they bled on the dome. It wasn't enough to kill either of them. No, what killed them was Marston delivering a trio of bullets to each of their heads. That finally made them stop moving. "Look out," Naomi said, forming a new spike of ice to intercept an anima spawn as it leapt for Marston. It impaled itself by the shoulder, snapping off the ice but losing its momentum. This was the first one that had gone for her, its mouth still locked up with the worst kind of frostbite. Marston aimed to shoot this one, then spun, firing on one behind Naomi. Stepping past each other, they each engaged a monster. The anima spawn in front of her swiped out with claws coated in her blood. Naomi dodged the swing, but reached out and caught the arm. It swiped with the other arm, but Naomi grabbed this one at the elbow. Then she let the Aquam flow. Ice ran up both of the creature's arms. It flailed, starting to crack the ice, so she drove her cleats down its shin and into its foot over and over. Finally, there was enough ice to pin its arms, and she reached up and clapped her hands over the thing's nose. Again, she let the Aquam flow. The nostrils bulged as ice expanded inside, before eventually, translucent, frigid spikes burst through all sides of the creature's skull. The monster went slack in her grasp, and she let it collapse to the floor. She hoped she'd made that as painless as possible. She spun, ready to back up Marston, but the monster he'd been fighting was also on the floor. This was the one who'd been lucid enough to speak. Something to remind them that there was some level of awareness in there, even as a monster. Marston fired several shots into its head, and it went still. He looked up at her with a grim but relieved expression. Naomi's shoulders sagged, and she licked at lips gone dry. Is it over? She asked. I find that it's best never to ask that question, Marston said. It can always get worse. You really do need to take some time off and relax, dude. Marston frowned, but good-naturedly. I am relaxed. Now. I can tell. All the negativity just screams. I feel calm and happy inside. This drew a snort from him. I am happy. We took out all the monsters, and we didn't die. Double win. They both sagged then, their breathing starting to normalize. Gunfire rang out down the hall. They wheeled as the doors burst open. Multiple Bradburn troops poured into the room, firing behind them as they ran. Enormous forms leapt from the dark, throwing men against walls and making quick work of the guards. As Naomi and Marston watched, over a dozen men were killed by 3 more monsters. This time, however, the monsters were brown instead of white. Their forms were almost fully quadrupedal, and they were each easily twice as large as the morphed sneppards that Naomi and Marston had just fought. Their eyes flared with prismatic intensity as Marston illuminated the trio with his torchlight. Their lips curled back in snarls that were almost roars, exposing fangs the size of Naomi's thumbs. They looked more feral than the Nulfs they had once been, but there was a frightening intensity to the intelligence in their eyes. One of them slowly stalked forward, using its hands like forepaws, making a soft crunch in the snow and ice with every step. Naomi's hand shot out to rest on Marston's gun. Maybe we don't want to shoot the thing that's angry because Bradburn's guys have been shooting it. Slowly, Marston lowered his gun, leaving the light trained on the creature, but in a manner that was hopefully less threatening. I've only got 5 rounds left anyway. That's not enough for all of them. The creature was close enough to touch now. It loomed over both of them, even hunched over as it was. Then, like a suspecting deerhound, it sniffed loudly at them. We're not your enemies, Naomi said in Null. If the creature understood her, it didn't show it, but the intelligence in its eyes was inescapable. It may not know her words, but something about her scent must have gotten through. With one final snort, the creature turned and loped back to the others. Then, with a silence that defied their bulk, they disappeared down the hall. Marston and Naomi both let out pent-up breaths. I thought for sure we were dead, Marston muttered. With a laugh, Naomi said, Honestly, so did I. He turned to her with a raised eyebrow. Weren't you just preaching at me about negativity? Yeah, someone needs to, or you'll be a basket case before you reach retirement. If I continue working for Madame Dolahan, I'm not sure I'll live to see retirement. Retracting her spikes, Naomi let herself punch him in the arm now. Course you will. I have to make sure you live that long, so you actually learn my name. He stared at her blankly. Her eyes widened, and she groaned. You're kidding. Notemi? He asked, narrowing his eyes and snapping his fingers. Naoni! The twinkle in his eyes was impossible to miss, and she punched him again when she realized she'd been had. Bracker. Oh, look at that. 3 minutes till 9. Where is... I love that art of Naomi. So yeah, we're going to call it there for the night. Lots of excitement in these chapters. But more. I mean, we're making real good progress. We are... If I can see my page. Down to the last 115 pages. Kind of hard to believe. We're 360 pages into this, and we only got 115 pages to go. So we're on episode 21. I mean, we're legitimately going to finish this in the next 2, maybe 3 episodes. So we'll be done just in time for Christmas. Actually, yeah, I think we're gonna wrap up like the week before Christmas, probably. Oh, it's the good stuff. Well, as always, thank you all so much for joining me. I'm really glad that people enjoy the book and like coming to hang out to hear it. We're in the end game. It's exciting. I'm so excited for next Tuesday. It's gonna be fun. So thank you all for coming. I hope you have a great night. If you live in the States, happy Thanksgiving. And I'll catch you guys next Tuesday. Bye bye.